The boy came out of the gray morning at a dead run, his boots slapping through slush the color of weak coffee, and he did not stop until he crashed into the porch post of bells crossing hard enough to rattle the tin roof above him. Miss Celia, the water's coming. The whole dam's give way up at Willow Bend. My pa said run and don't look back. Celia Bell was already out the door with a shawl half around her shoulders, flour still on her hands from the morning bread. She caught the boy, Tobias Reed, by both arms before he could stumble past her into the yard, and she held him there until his chest stopped heaving. "Slow down," she said, in the voice she used for spooked horses and grieving strangers alike, low and even and impossible to ignore. "Willow Bend is 6 miles east. Are you certain that is what your father said? He said the road's washing out and folks got to get up on the ridge." A second rider came in behind him, spraying mud from a laboring bay gelding, and this one was a grown man, one of the freighters who hauled coal down from the vein mine to the rail spur. He did not wait for an introduction. "Miss Bell, it ain't the dam at all," he called, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. "It's the mine. The lower gallery's taking water fast, and Vane's got men still down there on account of he don't want to lose a day's coal. I come to see if you had rope, chain, anything, because there ain't enough at the Tipple house." Celia looked from the terrified child to the grim-faced freighter, and for one long breath the whole gray morning seemed to hold its breath with her. 2 stories, 2 directions, one thaw-swollen creek system feeding both disasters at once, because that was how a fall spring worked in this country. It melted everything at once, and did not care what stood in the water's way. It was George Winslow, coming out of the barn with a coil of surveyor's chain over one shoulder, who spoke first. "Both," he said. "It can be both. The same runoff that would take out an earthen dam at Willow Bend is the water table rising under Vane's lower gallery. Different problem, same cause." He looked at Celia, not the freighter, not the boy, because in the 2 days he had been laid up at her waystation with a splinted wrist he had learned that Celia Bell was the one who made the decisions that mattered here. "Which is more likely to kill people today?" "The mine," Celia said, without hesitation. "Willow Bend has high ground on both sides, and every family there has lived through spring melt before. The mine has men underground, and a company that has never once in 3 years spent $1 it did not have to." She was already moving as she said it, back through the door for her boots, her coat, the oilskin satchel she kept packed with bandages and quinine, and a bottle of laudanum for the worst of it, because a waystation on a military road learned to be ready for anything that came limping or bleeding or half drowned up from the flats. Tobias Reed grabbed her sleeve. "But my pa said." "Your pa is right to be careful, and you did exactly right to come and tell someone," Celia said, crouching so she was eye level with him, flour and mud and all. "I want you to ride to the Hendersons' place, not Willow Bend, because it sits higher, and tell them what you told me, and tell them to send a man on to warn every soul between here and the Bend. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, some of the wild fear in his face settling now that he had a task instead of only terror. "Good boy," she said, and meant it, and he was gone again in a spray of mud, already forgetting to be afraid because he was too busy being useful. George was watching her with an expression she had seen on him twice before in 2 days, once when she had reset a dislocated shoulder for a teamster with nothing but her hands and a leather strap for him to bite, and once when she had talked a spooked mule team down off a washed-out grade with nothing but her voice. It was not quite admiration. It was closer to a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. "You have done this before," he said. "I have buried someone this water took," Celia said, and did not explain further because there was no time, and because some things were not for the telling on a morning when men might already be drowning in the dark under Cyrus Vane's mountain. They rode for the mine within the quarter hour, George favoring his splinted wrist against his chest, the freighter setting a pace that spared the horses only as much as the urgency allowed. The military road that ran between Fort Fetterman and Fort Laramie had never been meant for this kind of weather. It had been cut by Army engineers a decade before for wagons and cavalry, graded to drain toward the borrow ditches on either side. But a false thaw in the second week of March had turned every low crossing into a brown, churning hazard, and twice they had to walk the horses through water that came up over the fetlocks, feeling for the roadbed with careful feet, because the surface underneath was not to be trusted. "You know this road better than any man I have met in the territory," George said, when they slowed to pick their way across a culvert that had partly washed out overnight. "I have run this road for 9 months," Celia said. "A waystation only survives if the woman running it knows every crossing, every ford, every place the ice goes rotten before it looks rotten. I learned it because I had to, not because anyone offered to teach me." There was an edge under that last sentence, and George heard it and filed it away rather than pressing on it, which was, though neither of them said so, the first small proof that he was capable of listening rather than only deciding. They smelled the mine before they saw it, coal smoke and wet earth and something else underneath, a mineral coldness that Celia had come to associate with disaster in exactly this shape. When the tipple house came into view, they saw men already gathered at the mouth of the lower adit, shouting down into the dark, and a rope crew hauling on a line that led nowhere good. "How many down there?" George called, swinging off his horse before it had fully stopped. "9," said a heavy-set man with a foreman's lantern still lit uselessly in the gray daylight. "9 men, and the water's coming up the main gallery faster than we can bail it. Cyrus Vane's telling us to keep the pumps going and not to panic the town, on account of there's an election coming, and he don't want it said his mine floods." Celia's hands went very still on the reins. "His mine floods because he never shored the lower gallery the way the inspection called for," she said, and her voice had gone flat and cold in a way George had not yet heard from her. "It flooded once before. It took my sister." George looked at her then, really looked, and understood at last what had been sitting behind her eyes since the moment the freighter had said Vane's mine was taking water. He did not say he was sorry. There was no time for it, and she would not have wanted it just then in any case. What he said instead was, "Then you know this mountain. Show me where the water is coming from, and we will get those 9 men out before it finds them." It was not a question, and it was not an order either. It was an offer of partnership, clumsy and urgent, the first one he had ever made to a woman who did not need to be told what to do so much as she needed someone willing to do it beside her. They went down into the tipple yard together, and the long day's reckoning began. 9 men came up out of that flooding gallery before nightfall, cold and shaking and alive, hauled hand over hand up a rope Celia herself had helped anchor, because she understood the old timber crib work better than the mine's own hired engineer, who had been in the territory only 4 months and had never worked a flooding gallery in his life. George Winslow spent 6 hours in freezing water up past his knees, his splinted wrist bound tight against his ribs, directing men to shore up a collapsing support with green timber cut on the spot, because if that support went, the whole lower gallery would come down on whoever remained inside. When the last man, a wiry Welshman named Daffyd Price, came up coughing black water and swearing in 2 languages, Cyrus Vane himself finally appeared at the mine mouth, dry and clean in a good wool coat, to declare in a carrying voice that the operation had been a triumph of good management under difficult natural conditions, and that he would be certain to mention in his remarks before the election how well his mine had weathered the thaw. Celia Bell, soaked to the waist, her hair come loose from its pins, looked at him with an expression that made even the hired engineer take a step back. "Your management killed my sister 8 months ago in that same gallery," she said, loud enough that every man on the tipple platform heard it. "You were told the lower supports needed replacing. You paid a man to say they did not. If Mr. Winslow had not been passing through my waystation with a surveyor's chain and an engineer's eye, there would be 9 widows in this camp tonight instead of 9 men warming themselves by that fire." Vane's smile did not waver which told George more about the man than any ledger could have. "Grief does strange things to a woman's memory, Miss Bell," he said smoothly. "I am sorry for your loss, truly. But I will not be lectured on my own operation by a saloon singer with a grudge." "Former saloon singer," Celia said. "I left that life because I was tired of men like you deciding what I was owed. I am not leaving this one." She turned and walked back toward the horses without waiting for a reply, and George, wringing water from his sleeves, found that he had never in his life wanted so badly to follow a woman anywhere she chose to go. The preacher came to Bell's Crossing 3 days later, riding the circuit between the fort chapels and the scattered homestead cabins, a good enough man in his way, Reverend Amos Whitfield, gray at the temples, sincere in his convictions, and entirely unprepared for what he found waiting for him at Celia's table. He had come, he said, because word of the mine flooding had reached him, and because he understood Celia Bell had made something of a spectacle of herself, accusing a respectable businessman of murder in front of half the mining camp. "I did not accuse him of murder," Celia said, setting a cup of coffee in front of him with more force than the gesture strictly required. "I accused him of negligence and of paying an inspector to hide it, and both of those things are true." "Perhaps," the preacher allowed, folding his hands. "But Celia, I have watched you these past months, ever since Hannah passed. You have closed yourself off from the comfort of the church. You refuse the company of decent men who might see you settled and safe. You have taken to riding out on rescues that are properly a man's business. And now you stand in a mine yard shouting accusations at a man of Cyrus Vane's standing. I fear grief has hardened something in you that was once soft and trusting, and I worry for your soul." George Winslow, seated at the far end of the table mending a bridle strap with his good hand, went very still, the needle motionless in the leather. Celia set down the coffee pot slowly. "You think grief makes me weak," she said. "I think grief makes a woman vulnerable to bitterness," the preacher said gently, meaning it kindly, which was somehow worse. "I have seen it before. A woman loses someone dear and she either turns to the Lord for comfort or she turns hard, and hardness is not a virtue in a woman, Celia, whatever this modern age may tell you. Let me tell you what grief has done to me, Reverend." Celia's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Grief taught me to read a ledger better than any man in that mining camp, because I spent 3 months going through every book Cyrus Vane's company would show a grieving sister, looking for the inspection report that would prove what happened to Hannah was no accident of nature. Grief taught me to shoe a horse, because I could not always afford to hire it done, and taught me to set a bone, because the nearest doctor is 11 miles distant on a road that floods every spring. Grief is the reason I bought this waystation with the little money Hannah left me, so that other women traveling this road would have one safe place to stop that was not a saloon owned by a man who thought their bodies were part of the wage he paid them." She leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. "You call that weakness. I call it the only thing standing between the people on this road and men like Vane and Hollis Pratt, who would happily drown every miner in that camp and steal every vote in this county so long as it kept the coal moving and the money in their own pockets. Grief did not break me, Reverend. It burned everything soft out of me that could be broken, and what is left is not weak. It is unbreakable. And I would thank you, the next time you come to my table, to remember which one of us has spent this winter pulling drowning men out of a flooded mine, and which one of us has spent it writing sermons about my soul from the comfort of a dry church." The preacher's face had gone through several colors during this speech, and by the end of it he looked, George thought, rather like a man who had walked confidently onto ice only to feel it crack beneath him. "I meant no insult," Whitfield said finally, quietly. "I see now that I spoke from ignorance of what your days actually hold, Miss Bell. I will not make that mistake again." He left not long after, chastened, and did not return for several weeks, and when he did come back, it was with rather more humility and considerably less advice about the softening effects of Christian sorrow. "George," set aside the bridle strap once the door had shut behind the preacher. "I have known that man 3 years," he said. "I have never once seen him at a loss for words before." "I did not do it for the pleasure of it," Celia said, though there was a faint, grim satisfaction in her voice all the same as she gathered up the coffee cups. "No," George agreed. "But I imagine it needed saying regardless. He is not the only one in this territory who has mistaken your grief for softness." He paused, choosing his next words with visible care, a man unused to admitting fault aloud. "I nearly made a version of his mistake myself, back at the mine. I was ready to tell you to stay above ground with the wives while the rescue went on below. I am glad I did not, because you knew that timber crib worked better than I did, and 9 men are alive partly because you did not listen to what I nearly said." Celia looked at him for a long moment, something unguarded moving behind her eyes. "That is the first time," she said slowly, "that a man has told me he was glad I did not do as he wished." "Then the men in your life before me were fools," George said, and the plainness of it, the total lack of flattery in his tone, made her laugh, a short, surprised sound that seemed to startle them both. It was, though neither of them named it that night, the beginning of the two of them learning to stand beside each other rather than one of them standing in front. George Winslow had come up the military road in the first place on Union Pacific business, sent by the railroad's district superintendent to survey a proposed spur connecting the vein coal operation to the mainline near Rock River, a project the company wanted badly, because veins coal burned hotter and cheaper than anything hauled in from carbon. What George had found in 3 weeks of surveying, however, troubled him a good deal more than grade percentages and culvert placements. He had found, first, that the timbering specifications Vane's own engineer had filed with the county assessor bore almost no resemblance to what George's practiced eye told him actually held up the lower galleries. He had found, second, a set of receipts, glimpsed only briefly in the company office while waiting for Vane to sign a right-of-way agreement, showing payments to a county inspector named Otis Cray for services that did not match any inspection George could find record of. And he had found, third, entirely by accident, a conversation not meant for his ears, between Vane and a heavy-set man named Silas Rourke who ran hired muscle for the mine, discussing which homestead families along the road might need a visit before the special election in 3 weeks' time to remind them where their interests lay. George had written all of this down in a plain leather notebook he had carried since his surveying apprenticeship in Ohio, in the careful, undramatic hand of a man used to recording bearings and elevations, because that was the only kind of courage he fully trusted in himself, the courage to write true things down and let them stand. He had not, until the night after the preacher's visit, told Celia the full extent of what he had found. "I did not want to put you in more danger than you were already in," he admitted, when at last he laid the notebook open on her kitchen table by lamplight, 3 weeks after the mine flooding, with the special election now only 16 days away. "You had already lost your sister to this man's negligence. I did not think it was mine to hand you the rest of it." Celia turned the pages slowly, reading his cramped surveyor's notes on inspection fraud and voter intimidation, with a stillness that George had learned meant she was thinking very hard rather than feeling nothing. "That," she said finally, closing the notebook with a snap, "was not your decision to make alone, George Winslow." "I know that now," he said, and had the grace to look uncomfortable rather than defensive. "I am telling you now. You are telling me 3 weeks late, after I have already stood in a mine yard and called Cyrus Vane a murderer to his face, without knowing you already had proof enough to put him and Hollis Pratt both in the territorial prison." Her voice was sharp but not unkind, the voice of a woman correcting a course rather than ending a partnership. "I do not need you to protect me from the truth, George. I need you to trust me with it. There is a difference, and if we are going to do whatever it is we are about to do together, you will need to learn it." "I am trying to learn it," George said. "I have spent most of my life being the man who fixes things quietly and does not ask anyone else's opinion first. My father built bridges that way, and I built rail grades that way, and it has never once occurred to me before now that a woman might want to be handed the whole truth rather than the comfortable half of it. He met her eyes. I am telling you the whole truth now because you have earned it 10 times over and because I do not want to be the kind of man your preacher warned you about, deciding what is too heavy for you to carry. Celia's expression softened, though she did not let him entirely off the hook. Good, she said simply. Now, tell me about Otis Cray, and tell me everything Celia's work said about visiting homestead families, because I know most of those families, George, and I intend to warn every one of them myself. They spent that night and several after it building, piece by piece, a case against Hollis Pratt and Cyrus Vane that neither of them could have built alone. Celia knew every family within a day's ride, knew which ones had daughters or wives who would be voting in this county for the first time in their lives now that Wyoming territory allowed it, knew which men had accepted small loans from Vane's company store that could be called due at an inconvenient moment. George knew the language of ledgers and surveys, knew how to read a falsified inspection report and see the lie underneath the numbers, knew, from his railroad work, exactly which county officials answered to the Union Pacific's district office and which ones did not, which meant he knew who might actually be willing to act on what they found. Between the practical work of it, in the quiet hours after supper when the waystation's few travelers had gone to their beds, something else was growing that neither of them spoke of directly. George took to leaving small notes tucked into the ledger Celia kept for the waystation accounts, brief lines meant for her eyes only when she balanced the week's receipts. You did not eat today, I noticed. Eat something before you ride to the Hendersons. Or once, folded small and left beneath her hairbrush, where only she would find it. I have crossed 4 territories in this work, and never once met a woman who could read a flooding mine timber the way you did. I think of it more often than I ought to admit. Celia, who had spent 2 years learning never to trust a man's flattery after her time at the Gilded Spur, found herself keeping every one of these notes in a tin box that had once held Hannah's hairpins, and found herself, more than once, sitting up past midnight with her own journal writing things she had not yet found the courage to say aloud. He asks my opinion before he acts, she wrote one night in March, the ink a little smeared where the lamp had guttered low. I did not know how starved I was for that until he began doing it. Jonas Kettering asked my opinion of nothing in 4 years, except which songs would draw the biggest crowd and the biggest bar receipts. George Winslow asked me tonight whether I thought Otis Cray could be persuaded to testify honestly if he were offered protection, and then he listened to my answer as though it mattered as much as his own thinking on the matter. I am afraid of how much I have come to want him to keep asking. She did not show him that page. But 2 nights later, working late over the ledger together, George found the tin box by accident while reaching for a pencil, and though he did not open it, he saw Hannah's name worked into the lid in Celia's careful hand, and understood without being told what it meant that she had chosen to keep his foolish little notes inside a box meant to hold her sister's memory. I am sorry, he said, closing the drawer gently. I did not mean to pry. You did not pry, Celia said, and there was something almost shy in it, an emotion strange on a woman who had faced down Cyrus Vane in front of half a mining camp without flinching. I have been meaning to tell you. I keep them. Your notes. I do not entirely know what to do with the fact that I keep them. George set down the pencil very carefully, as though the moment were something that might shatter if he moved too quickly. I have been writing them, he said, because I did not trust myself to say the things plainly in case you did not want to hear them, and I did not want to make this work between us into something it was not meant to be. But I think, perhaps, I have been a coward about it in the same way I was a coward about showing you my notebook 3 weeks late. He took a breath. Celia Bell, I think I have come to care for you in a way that goes a good deal further than admiring your skill with a flooding mine timber, and I would rather say it badly and plainly than keep hiding it in a hairbrush drawer. Celia's laugh this time was softer than the one the preacher's visit had won from her, and there were tears standing unshed in her eyes that had nothing to do with grief. "That," she said, "was said plainly enough, George Winslow." She reached across the ledger and took his hand, the good one, careful of the wrist still healing beneath its wrapping. "I have come to care for you as well. I did not think, after everything, that I would have room in me for it. I am glad to find I was wrong." He did not kiss her that night. It was not yet time. Both of them understood without saying so, not with Holly's Pratt's men still riding the road, and an election still hanging in the balance and Hannah's death still unanswered for. But he held her hand a good while longer than the moment strictly required, and when at last he rode out at dawn to carry a warning to the Hendersons' place, she stood on the porch and watched him go with an ache in her chest that felt, for the first time in 8 months, more like hope than like grief. The trouble came, as it so often does, in the deceptive middle of good news. Otis Cray, the county inspector who had certified Vane's falsified timber reports, agreed at last to speak, frightened enough of what he had seen in that flooding gallery, and guilty enough about the 9 men who had nearly died, that he sent word through a Henderson boy that he would meet George at the Fort Sutler's store near Fort Fetterman and give a sworn statement before a notary, provided he could be got safely out of the county afterward. It should have been a triumph. Instead, 2 days before that meeting was to take place, George rode out to fetch the notary and returned after dark to find the Sutler's store burned to a smoking shell, and Otis Cray gone. Whether fled or taken no one could say for certain, though a boy who worked the stable swore he had seen Celia's work and 2 other men riding hard toward the mine camp the night before. Worse than that, when George reached into his saddlebag for his surveying notebook, the pages of careful notes on the falsified inspections, the receipts, the overheard conversation about visiting homestead families, he found only ash. Someone had gone through his gear while his horse stood tied outside the burning store, and had taken the notebook and put it to the flame along with whatever else Cray might have carried. He rode back to Bell's Crossing in a state Celia had not yet seen in him, a controlled, simmering fury that had nowhere useful to spend itself. "They knew," he said, pacing her kitchen floor while she banked the fire against the night's chill. "They knew where Cray meant to meet me, which means someone we trusted told them, or someone has been reading our letters, or—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "The notebook is gone, Celia. 3 weeks of evidence. Cray is gone. We have nothing left but our own word against a mine owner and a sitting commissioner 2 weeks before the election. And if I go to the district superintendent now with nothing to show, he will tell me to mind my surveys and leave county politics to county men, because the Union Pacific wants that coal spur built more than it wants an honest election in a county it does not answer to." Celia set down the poker and turned to face him fully. "Then we build the case again," she said. "Only this time we do not carry it in one notebook that can be burned in one fire. Build it how? Cray is our only witness and he is gone." "He is not our only witness," Celia said. "He is our only witness who worked for the county. But I have lived on this road for 9 months and sung in that mining camp's saloon for 2 years before that, George. I know 6 women whose husbands have been threatened by Rourke's men, and I know the wife of the man who actually poured the lower gallery's concrete footings, and she told me a year ago, long before Hannah died, that her husband complained the company had cut his order for timber by 1/3 and told him to make do. She remembers it because it was the same week her boy was born, and she remembers the date exactly." Celia's eyes were bright now, not with tears but with the particular fierce clarity George had come to recognize as her mind fully engaged. "We do not need one notebook. We need a room full of people willing to say, on the same day, in front of witnesses, what they have each seen separately. Pratt and Vane can burn one man's evidence. They cannot burn a room." George looked at her for a long moment, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight since he found the ashes in his saddlebag began, slowly, to loosen. "You are talking about a public meeting," he said. Before the election. I am talking about the town hall meeting that happens every year the week before a county election, where every candidate is meant to speak and every voter is meant to ask questions, Celia said. Pratt cannot refuse to hold it without admitting he is afraid of what will be said, and I intend to be standing in that room when Elias Ferris finishes his remarks, ready to speak. They will not let you speak, George said, not to discourage her but because it was true and because he had learned, finally, that the honest warning was a form of respect she would rather have than a comfortable silence. Pratt controls who is recognized to address that meeting. Then I will not wait to be recognized, Celia said, and the ghost of Reverend Whitfield's chastened face seemed to pass briefly behind her eyes. Grief taught me that lesson too, George. Sometimes you do not wait for permission to speak the truth. You simply speak it and let the room decide what to do with it after. They spent the next 10 days rebuilding what the fire had taken, and more besides. Celia rode from homestead to homestead, sometimes with George, sometimes alone when his surveying duties for the railroad could not be avoided without raising suspicion, gathering accounts from women whose husbands were too afraid of Vane's company store debts to speak for themselves, but who found, in Celia Bell's quiet, unshakable presence at their kitchen tables, the courage to write down what they had seen and sign their names to it. Sarah Prout, whose husband had poured the lower gallery's footings, gave a written statement about the shortened timber order, dated and witnessed by her own minister. Ironically enough, since Reverend Whitfield, chastened and thoughtful since his humbling at Celia's table, had quietly begun making himself useful notarizing statements, and would say only, when asked why, that he had come to think there were forms of ministry that did not involve standing in a pulpit. George, for his part, rode the 30 miles to Rawlins on a pretext of railroad business, and returned with something better than his burned notebook. A certified copy of the original mine safety filing from the Territorial Mining Office, the one Vane's company had submitted before Otis Cray's falsified amendment, which showed in the mine's own original paperwork exactly what timbering had been specified and never installed. It was not proof of the bribery itself, but it was proof, in the company's own hand, that they had known what safety the law required and had chosen not to provide it. Celia's works men made 2 more attempts at intimidation in that stretch of days, once riding past Bell's crossing at night firing pistols into the air, until George stood on the porch with a shotgun and made plain he would not be frightened off his own doorstep, and once stopping Celia herself on the road to the Hendersons, 2 riders blocking her path with their horses, until she looked one of them dead in the eye and said, in a voice that did not shake, that Celia's work could tell Cyrus Vane that the widow of no man and the sister of a dead woman had considerably less to lose than he seemed to think, and that if his men wished to be named specifically in a sworn statement about voter intimidation, they were welcome to keep riding at her. The men, uncertain what to do with a woman who refused to be afraid, let her pass. It was 3 days before the town hall meeting, with the case nearly assembled and the thaw still working its slow damage on every low crossing in the county, that the second, greater danger arrived, the one that would decide far more than an election. The rains came hard for 2 days straight, on top of snowmelt already saturating the ground, and word reached Bell's crossing by a half-drowned rider that Vane, desperate to keep coal moving before the election so he could point to production figures as proof of his good management, had ordered the lower gallery reopened despite standing water, and had sent men back down to work double shifts, over the objections of his own foreman, to finish loading 2 weeks' worth of coal before the vote. George heard it and went pale in a way Celia had not seen since the burned notebook. Those supports we shored in March were never meant to be permanent, he said. I told the foreman that myself. Green timber holds for weeks, not months, especially not understanding water. If that gallery has men in it now in this rain on top of what we already reinforced, how long, Celia said, already reaching for her coat. I do not know, hours, maybe less. They rode for the mine through rain that had turned the military road into a brown river in places, the same road that 8 months ago had carried Hannah Bell's body home in a wagon. And Celia did not let herself think of that as she rode, because there was no room left in her for anything but the men who might still be saved. They reached the mine yard to chaos. The foreman, a decent man named Nathan Cole who had argued against reopening the gallery and been overruled, was shouting orders to a rope crew already at the adit mouth, and the water pouring out of the tunnel entrance told its own story before anyone spoke a word. 11 men down there, Cole said, when he saw George. The far gallery's already flooded past the waist. I sent 2 men in an hour ago to call them out, and they haven't come back either. The support timbers, George said. The ones we shored in March at the second crosscut, groaning like a dying animal the last time anyone got close enough to hear, Cole said grimly. I would not send another man down there if Vane himself put a gun to my head, and I told him so an hour ago. Where is Vane? Cheyenne, arranging his election dinner, Cole spat, left me holding the whole disaster. George was already stripping off his coat. I know that crosscut better than anyone left in this yard. I helped shore it. I know which supports will hold weight and which ones are already failing. George. Celia caught his arm, and for one terrible moment he expected her to tell him not to go, to protect herself from losing him the way she had lost Hannah, and some old instinct in him rose up ready to gently set her aside and go regardless, because that was what a man did for the woman he loved. He did not get the chance to make that mistake, because Celia was already shrugging out of her own coat. I am coming with you, she said. I know that tunnel's layout as well as you do the support work, better perhaps, because I carried food down to the men on the day shift for 2 years before Hannah died, back when I still sang at the Gilded Spur, and Vane let the miners' families enduring off hours for a fee. I know where the air pockets form near the roof when a gallery floods, because I have seen it happen once before, on the day it took my sister, and I have spent 8 months wishing I had known then what I know now. I'm not staying in this yard while you go into that dark alone, George Winslow, and if you try to tell me to stay behind for my own safety, I will remind you what we agreed to at my kitchen table 3 weeks ago. George looked at her for one long, taut second, rain running down both their faces, 11 men's lives somewhere in the black water beneath their feet, and felt something in him settle into place with a certainty that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with respect. Then we go together, he said. Nathan, I need every lantern this camp owns, all the rope you have, and any man willing to hold a line at the surface, because we are not leaving 11 men and 2 rescuers down there when those supports go. They went into the mine together with lanterns held high above the rising water, George reading the failing timbers with an engineer's practiced eye, calling out which crosscuts were safe to wade and which were not. Celia leading them unerringly through side passages. She remembered from 2 years of carrying meals to hungry, exhausted miners, passages that cut a full quarter-mile off the route to the trapped men, and that George, for all his surveying, had never known existed. They found the 11 men, and the 2 who had gone in after them huddled on a rock shelf above the rising water in the far gallery, exhausted, several with minor injuries, one man feverish and only half conscious, the water already at chest height on the shorter men and climbing steadily. The support timber at the second crosscut, the one George himself had shored in March, groaned audibly overhead as they worked, a deep, grinding complaint of wood and rock under a strain it had never been built to bear for this long. We cannot bring them out the way we came, George said, calculating fast, water and time and the failing structure above them all at once. That crosscut will not hold the weight of 14 people crossing it twice more. We need another route. There is one, Celia said, an old ventilation shaft cut for airflow before they extended the gallery back when this was still a smaller working. It comes up behind the tipple house, away from the crosscut entirely. I have not been in it myself, but Hannah told me of it the week before she died. She said the men used it sometimes to cool off in summer. Her voice caught only slightly on her sister's name. "It should still be there." "Should be is not certain," George said. "Certain is a rope crew standing at the surface waiting for the walls to come down on top of everyone still in this tunnel," Celia said. "I am not asking you to trust the shaft blindly, George. I am asking you to trust that Hannah would not have told me about it if it had not still been sound the last time she walked past it, and that was less than a week before the water took her." George held her gaze for one more second in the lantern light, water rising around both their boots, and made his choice. "Lead the way," he said. The ventilation shaft was narrow and half-collapsed in one section, requiring the men to pass through single file. The feverish miner carried between two others on a makeshift sling made from George's coat and a length of the rescue rope. And twice George had to clear fallen rock with his bare hands while Celia held the lantern steady and kept a nervous count of every man who passed her, refusing to move forward herself until the last one had cleared each narrow point. Behind them, deep in the flooded gallery, the groan of failing timber rose to a sharp, splitting crack, and then a roar of collapsing rock and rushing water that shook dust from the shaft's ceiling and sent every man in that narrow passage running the last 100 yards toward the gray circle of daylight above. They came up out of the old ventilation shaft behind the Tipple house into driving rain, and a yard full of people who had given up hope of seeing any of them again. Nathan Cole's rope crew, abandoning their useless lines at the main adit, and running toward the sound of the collapse only to find, instead of a tragedy, 13 exhausted, soaked, filthy, laughing, weeping men climbing out of a hole in the ground behind the Cole Tipple, with George Winslow and Celia Bell coming out last of all. Her arm braced under the shoulder of the feverish miner, George's hands bleeding from clearing rockfall, both of them alive. Nathan Cole reached them first, gripping George's hand so hard it must have hurt the healing wrist, and then, to everyone's evident astonishment, turning to grip Celia's hand with the same fierce gratitude. "Miss Bell," he said, his voice rough, "I have worked this mine for years and never once heard tell of that shaft. You saved every one of these men's lives today, and I mean to see the whole county hears it before this election, whatever Cyrus Vane has to say about it." Word of the flooded gallery collapse and the rescue that beat it by minutes traveled faster through the county than any letter or newspaper could have carried it, faster even than Celia's works men could ride to suppress it, because it traveled on the tongues of 13 men who had been certain they would drown and had not, and on the tongues of their wives and children and neighbors, each retelling adding its own detail, but none of them able to alter the essential, undeniable truth at the center of it. Cyrus Vane had reopened a flooding gallery against his own foreman's warning, in order to protect his election season coal figures, and it had very nearly killed 13 men, and it had been George Winslow's engineering and Celia Bell's knowledge of that mountain, knowledge she had, and everyone now knew it, paid for with her own sister's life 8 months before, that had saved them. By the time the town hall meeting convened 3 days later in the long freight room of the Rock Creek stage station, the largest indoor space for 20 miles in any direction, there was no possibility of Holly's Pratt controlling who would be recognized to speak. The room was packed past its intended capacity. Homesteaders and mine families and freighters and off-duty soldiers from the fort standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls, lanterns burning bright against the evening dark, the air thick with wet wool and coal smoke and anticipation. Elias Ferris, the reform candidate, gave his prepared remarks first, a decent enough speech about honest inspections and fair wages, though it was clear from the restless energy in the room that no one had come tonight to hear campaign promises. Holly's Pratt spoke next, red-faced and blustering, attempting to characterize the mine collapse as an unfortunate natural event, no different from the thaw flooding that threatened the whole county's roads and dams that same season, entirely outside any man's control, and he had very nearly gotten through it, had very nearly reclaimed the room's sympathy with a well-practiced show of concern for the miners' welfare, when Celia Bell rose from her seat near the front without waiting to be recognized. exactly as she had promised George she would, and walked to the front of the room. "I have not been asked to speak," she said into the sudden hush, "but I intend to anyway, and I would ask this room to hear me out before Commissioner Pratt objects, because I believe you have a right to know what I know before you cast your votes tomorrow." Pratt began to protest, but the room itself would not let him. A low, grumbling insistence from a dozen throats at once that Miss Bell be allowed to finish, and he subsided, sweating, into an uneasy silence. "8 months ago," Celia said, her voice carrying clear and steady to every corner of that crowded room, "my sister Hannah Bell died in the lower gallery of Cyrus Vane's mine when floodwater breached support timbers that had been certified safe by County Inspector Otis Cray. I have here a sworn statement from Sarah Prout, whose husband poured the footings for that same gallery, dated the week of her son's birth, stating that Vane's company cut the ordered timber by a third and told him to make do. I have a certified copy of the original mining office filing, obtained from the territorial office in Rawlins, showing the timbering specifications that were legally required and never installed. And 3 days ago, 13 men very nearly died in that same gallery when Commissioner Pratt's largest financial supporter reopened flooded workings against his own foreman's express warning, in order to inflate his coal production figures before this very election. She let that settle over the room for a moment before continuing. "I could not save my sister. I did not know then what I know now. But 3 days ago, I helped lead 13 men out of that mountain through a ventilation shaft my sister told me about the week before she died, and I would ask every person in this room, before you cast a vote tomorrow, to consider what kind of county you wish to live in. One where a man can bribe an inspector, cut corners on the timber that holds up the ground over working men's heads, and still hold county office because he has money enough to intimidate the families who might vote against him. Or one where the truth, however inconvenient to powerful men, is allowed to be spoken plainly, in a room like this one, by anyone who has earned the right to speak it." Nathan Cole stood next, and then Sarah Prout herself, and then, one by one, half a dozen others whose names had appeared on the statements Celia and George had gathered over those difficult 2 weeks, each adding their own account, until the room had heard, in unvarnished and repeated testimony, a complete portrait of exactly what Hollis Pratt and Cyrus Vane had built together in this county, and exactly what it had cost. Reverend Amos Whitfield rose last of all, and the room quieted for him out of long habit, expecting perhaps a call for calm, for Christian forgiveness, for the matter to be left to God and the ballot box without further drama. "I notarized several of these statements myself," he said instead, surprising everyone including, visibly, himself. "I did so because a woman in this room taught me something about grief and strength this past month that I had gotten backward my whole ministry. I thought hardship that did not bend a person meant something had gone wrong in their soul. I have come to understand it can mean instead that something in their soul was forged strong enough to hold, and that we ought to be grateful for such people rather than suspicious of them. I would ask this county to remember tomorrow which candidate has surrounded himself with men willing to burn evidence and threaten homestead families, and which one has surrounded himself with people willing to stand in a room and tell the truth with their names attached to it." Cyrus Vane, who had come to the meeting confident of his standing, left it that night through a side door with Celia's work at his elbow, and did not stay to hear Hollis Pratt's stammering, ineffective attempt at rebuttal, which convinced approximately no one in that packed room. The election, held the following day at the schoolhouse and the Fort Sutler's replacement store, was not close. Elias Ferris carried the county by a wide margin, aided in no small part by a turnout of women voters, exercising a right Wyoming territory had granted them 8 years before, and that Hollis Pratt's men had specifically hoped to suppress through intimidation, who came out in numbers no one had predicted, many of them, it was later said, because Celia Bell herself had ridden to their homesteads in the preceding days to make certain they knew both their right and the location of the polling place, and to offer, where needed, an escort along a road that had lately grown dangerous for a woman traveling alone. Hollis Pratt did not wait for the territorial authorities to investigate the burned sutler's store or the disappearance of Otis Cray, who turned up safe a week later in Cheyenne, having fled there in genuine terror rather than been silenced permanently, and who gave, once safe, a full statement corroborating every piece of the case George and Celia had assembled. Pratt resigned his interim commission within the month and left the territory rather than face formal charges, and Cyrus Vane, stripped of his protection in the county office, found himself facing both a civil suit from Sarah Pruitt's husband and a formal safety investigation from the territorial mining office that resulted, eventually, in new ownership and new management for the Rock Creek mine, management that Nathan Cole, promoted to superintendent, insisted from his first day would never again cut a timber order to save $1 against a man's life. It was 2 weeks after the election, on an evening when the last of the thaw's damage had finally begun to dry from the military road, and the nights had turned mild in the particular way that meant true spring rather than false hope, had finally arrived, that George Winslow found Celia sitting on the porch of Bell's Crossing with her sister's tin box open on her lap, reading over his old notes by lantern light. "I have been thinking," she said, without looking up, "about what happens next. The railroad will want its spur built regardless of who owns the mine now. You will be needed elsewhere before long, wherever the next survey takes you." "I have been thinking about that as well," George said, sitting down beside her on the porch step. "I sent a letter to the district superintendent yesterday." Something in his voice made her look up. "Saying what?" "Saying that I have found in the course of my work in this territory that I have grown considerably more interested in a permanent life along this road than in chasing the next survey line west," George said. "There is a position, it turns out, for a resident engineer to oversee the new mine's safety compliance and the spur construction both, based here rather than traveling. I have accepted it, provided you have no objection to a railroad man taking up permanent residence within riding distance of your waystation." Celia closed the tin box slowly, her heart working harder than the moment's plain words should have accounted for. "I have no objection," she said, "though I would want it understood plainly, George Winslow, and not left folded up small in a note under a hairbrush, exactly what kind of residence you are proposing." George turned to face her fully in the lantern light, and there was nothing hesitant left in him now, no old instinct to decide gently on her behalf or soften the truth into something smaller than it was. "I am not proposing residence near you," he said. "I am proposing a life with you. I have watched you carry grief for 8 months in a way that built rather than broke you, and I have watched you build a safe place on this road for every frightened traveler and every wife and every runaway saloon singer with nowhere else to turn. And I have come, somewhere in these last weeks, to want nothing more than to spend the rest of my days standing beside you while you keep doing exactly that. Not in front of you, deciding what you can bear. Beside you, trusting that you know your own strength better than I ever could." He took her hand, the tin box between them still holding her sister's memory and his own foolish, honest notes both at once. "I love you, Celia Bell. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it to fix or rescue you, because I have finally learned you were never broken in the first place. I say it because I want to build whatever comes next with you as my equal, for as long as you will have me." Celia's eyes were bright with tears that were, this time, entirely unmixed with grief. "I love you as well, George Winslow," she said. "I did not think after Hannah that I would find room in myself for this kind of happiness. I am glad, every day now, to find I was wrong about that." She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "I do not need a church wedding with the whole county watching, if that is what you are working up to asking. I have had enough of being watched and judged and talked over for one lifetime. But I would take a promise from you, out here on this porch, under this sky, with no one but the two of us and Hannah's memory to witness it." "Then let it be that," George said, and drew a small, worn ring from his coat pocket, plain gold, no stone, the kind a working man might have saved for through careful months of railroad wages. "I will not call this a proposal in the way your preacher might expect. I am asking you to build a life beside me, Celia Bell, as my partner in every sense the word can hold on this road, in this territory, for as long as we both draw breath, and I am asking you to hold me to the promise that I will never again decide something is too heavy for you to carry without asking you first." Celia took the ring, turning it once in the lantern light before slipping it onto her finger, and found that it fit as though it had been made for exactly this hand and no other. "I promise the same to you," she said, "that I will never let you carry a burden alone that I have the strength to help shoulder, and that I will trust you with my whole truth the way I have learned, finally, to trust myself with it." She leaned forward and kissed him then, on the porch of the waystation she had built with her own hard-won courage, under a Wyoming sky finally free of the winter's false and dangerous thaw, with spring arriving at last in earnest. "Grief did not break me, George. You never once needed it to. I think that is why I loved you before I let myself say so." They sat together on that porch a long while after, past the point where the lantern needed refilling, past the point where either of them had anything left to prove to preachers or mine owners or a county that had, in the end, chosen truth over intimidation. Bell's Crossing stood quiet and solid behind them, the road ahead of it finally drying firm under the true spring sun, and somewhere down that road, Nathan Cole's mine ran safer now under new management, and Elias Ferris took up his office with the weight of an honest election behind him, and Otis Cray began, slowly, the long work of rebuilding a life he had nearly lost to fear. Reverend Whitfield married them 3 weeks later, not in a formal church ceremony with the whole county looking on, but in a small gathering on that same porch, Nathan Cole and Sarah Pruitt, and a handful of the Homestead families who had found their courage that spring standing witness, the preacher himself, humbled and wiser for the winter's hard lessons, speaking words that this time acknowledged plainly, in front of everyone gathered, that he had once mistaken a woman's grief for weakness and had been shown, in the most vivid and unforgettable way, exactly how wrong a man of God could be. Celia Bell became Celia Winslow that mild spring afternoon, though she kept her waystation running under both names on the sign George built for her, and kept the tin box with Hannah's name worked into the lid on the shelf above their bed, no longer only a repository for grief, but a small, private monument to everything that grief had taught her to become. George Winslow took up his post overseeing the mine's new safety standards and the long-delayed rail spur, and found in the years that followed that he had never once regretted trading a wandering surveyor's life for a settled one beside the strongest woman he had ever known. And on quiet evenings, when travelers had bedded down and the road outside lay peaceful under the stars, the two of them would sit together on that same porch, her hand in his, and neither of them needed to say aloud what they both understood by then to be simply and unshakably true. That grief, faced honestly and carried with courage rather than concealed as weakness, had not broken either of them at all. It had built, out of two lonely and capable people on a dangerous frontier road, a partnership that neither flood nor fire nor any corrupt man's schemes had managed to wash away. And it would, they both believed, hold steady for every mile of road still left ahead of them.